So this week I'm going to be talking about cultural appropriation. So I'd like to start off by thinking about, well, what is cultural appropriation? Because we hear an awful lot about cultural appropriation these days, and it isn't clear to most people what it actually is. So there tends to be two extremes in when we talk about cultural appropriation. There's one group of people saying that no one can ever do anything from another culture ever again. Now, clearly that's not true, because people learn things from other cultures all the time. There's another group of people saying nothing's cultural appropriation. It's all political correctness gone mad, which is a problematic concept in itself. We'll talk about that another time. So clearly, you know, as with most things, the truth must lie between these two extremes. Now, there's a very simple way to work out whether something is cultural appropriation or not. And that's the first question you should ask yourself is the culture that this thing is from an oppressed or marginalized culture? Because that should give you pause and make you wonder whether you should be engaging in the practice. Now, the other thing is, a lot of people seem to have the idea that the reason we can't do things from other cultures is because we don't share the genetic makeup of that other culture. Now, that is not correct. The reason that you can't just pick up a thing from another culture and run with it without checking to see if you're oppressing somebody is because you are not part of that culture. And the key word here is culture. I happen to be from the southeast. I had my genetics done, and I'm from the southeast corner of England, and all of my ancestors are also from the southeast corner of England. Now, given my colouring, dark hair, blue eyes, it's quite probable that I have some Celtic ancestry. However, I am not part of a living Celtic culture because I grew up in England. I now live in Canada. So I can't just waltz in and go, thanks, I'll have a big slice of Welsh culture, right? Or pick up little bits of Welsh culture that I fancy turning into something else, or even worse, erasing the Welshness of that thing. So if I want to go and learn about Welsh culture, it behooves me to go and learn from Welsh people. If I moved to Wales and lived in Wales and participated in their culture, then I could learn lots about Welsh culture, and people would be only too happy to teach me. What I can't do is say, oh, I like that little bauble of Welsh culture there. I will lift it out of context and move it over here. The same applies. Now, the reason I mentioned the Welsh is I read an excellent article today about people culturally appropriating Welsh stuff and trying to sort of file the serial numbers off it and turn it into pretend that it's not Welsh. Now, that is definitely a form of cultural appropriation. And it was on this. I've got links to it, which I will share at the end. But on a site called barvas.org, which is a very good website. So the thing about cultural appropriation is that it's about approaching other cultures with respect and not approaching them as some sort of smorgasbord of stuff that you can just nick and not really worry about where it came from. So my suggested list of what defines cultural appropriation is taking somebody else's practice without permission or proper handing on of the tradition. So if, for example, you go and learn yoga, you usually learn yoga from an accredited yoga teacher who's been authorized to teach it by some prior yoga teacher that also was authorized to teach it, and so on up the line, and hopefully back to a tradition in India. Now, of course, the way we do yoga in the West is very partial, because we tend to just pick up the exercise, whereas actually the yoga exercise is part of a much bigger group of practices from Indian culture and Hinduism. So the question of whether yoga is a sort of colonized, westernized version of yoga is a huge one, which I'm not really qualified to comment on. So, but there are lots of articles out there about decolonizing your yoga practice if you're interested. So taking somebody else's practice without permission or proper handing on of the tradition is cultural appropriation, especially if you then go on to make money out of it. And also if the originators of the practice have a tradition of teaching it to people for free, which is the case with Wicca, for example. We teach people Wicca for free in a coven setting. Then if you go and make money out of that practice, that's very unethical. And also, if people start distorting the teachings of the practice or tradition, right, that's really, really unhelpful. If you take somebody else's practice and do it in a completely different context where it doesn't fit, I think that's cultural appropriation. So an example of that is some Christians decided that they really liked the pagan wheel of the year. So they've started doing something called forest church, where they go into the forest and they cast a circle, they call the quarters, and they do pagan festivals, but with Jesus shoehorned into their practice. And, you know, I was just monumentally offended by that, to be honest. And a lot of other pagans are not offended by it, but I think it's offensive, especially after they've been spelling pagan with a small p for decades and generally being obnoxious. Another form of cultural appropriation is to take somebody else's ritual or practice or stories and pretend that they're your story. So, you know, if somebody sort of says, oh, this is they take a Native American story or an indigenous story from Turtle Island, and they take that story and then file the serial numbers off it and pretend that it's from their tradition. And also taking somebody else's ritual and then excluding them from it. Or doing somebody else's practice and then pretending that you were authorized to hand on that tradition by the people whose tradition it is, when actually that's not true. That would definitely be cultural appropriation. And then we have people who actually claim to be from that culture. Like, there are numerous authors and people who've made a lot of money out of indigenous North American spirituality, who have claimed a fake identity as an indigenous practitioner, and that is clearly a particularly egregious form of cultural appropriation. Now, one of the reasons that that is particularly bad is because a lot of indigenous people have lost touch with their culture, partly because of the 60s scoop, which is where indigenous kids were taken away and made to live with non-indigenous foster parents. And there are various other reasons why culture loss has occurred, residential schools being one of the reasons. So if those people who are trying to find their way back to indigenous culture and they start to look on the internet and try to find stuff, the first thing they're going to get, probably because of the way search algorithms work, the first thing they're going to see is the fake stuff. And that is terrible. You know, there's so much. I mean, take, for example, from a completely different context, I saw a person who is from Turkey pointing out the awfulness of Coleman Barks' translation of Rumi, which and people are constantly trying to say that Rumi was an international mystic and really nothing to do with Islam, and that Sufism isn't Islam. It's like, Sufism is part of Islam. Rumi was a Muslim. It's Islamic mysticism. And, you know, you can't just file the serial numbers off stuff and pretend that it's not, you know, sort of say this isn't really Islam because whatever. It's like, and then look up the way Coleman Barks does his translations, because they're just not right. I mean, oh, anyway, more examples of cultural appropriation. Doing others' spiritual practices and changing the meaning so that the practice becomes unrecognizable. Also, quite often when this happens, people fail to build in the appropriate safeguards that came with the original practice. And of course, people are failing to acknowledge that they've actually completely changed the meaning of the practice in the new context. Also, if the practice comes from an oppressed or marginalized group of people, then if you fail to acknowledge the history of oppression that's been suffered by that people, then, you know, by, for example, donating, giving back, doing something to help that group of people, then, you know, that's not good either. Also, doing something that's got nothing to do with the culture and dressing it up and claiming that it is part of that culture when you aren't a member of that culture. Now, one example of that is there's that story that does the rounds on the internet where it's like, there are two wolves inside of you. One's an angry wolf and the other one's a peaceable wolf, and you have to feed the peaceable wolf to turn yourself into a nice person, right? So a lot of people have claimed that this is an indigenous North American story. It is not. Apparently, it was actually made up by Billy Graham. So there you go. So check sources very carefully. I also see like random quotes floating around the internet claiming to be by Oscar Wilde, and I'm like, I mean, there's one that says something about a car, and I thought, hang on, Oscar Wilde died in 1904, and I guess there were cars around just before that, but anyway, seems a bit unlikely. So always check your sources, very important. So all of these examples of taking stuff from another culture, especially because you think it's exotic and cool, especially if, like, for example, a lot of people want to appropriate Black people's hairstyles, and those hairstyles have a sacred history, and like dreadlocks came from the Rastafarian movement, for example, and cornrows are a traditional African thing and they have a specific meaning. And Black people have been persecuted for wearing those hairstyles as well. So if we waltz along going, oh, look at my cornrows, oh, look at my dreadlocks, then and then fail to acknowledge that Black people have been marginalized and oppressed for having those hairstyles and are still being marginalized and oppressed for having those hairstyles, then, you know, that is not appropriate. And I mean, I'll come to pagans trying to revive our ancestral practices in a minute. So all of this stuff, like, you know, people wearing plains indigenous headdresses made of feathers and stuff like that, adds up to a culture that misrepresents and mythologizes indigenous peoples and makes their real struggles invisible, because they're seen as like, oh, exotic, and then they're kind of, people want them to stay frozen in the sort of 19th century image that we have of them, and they get misrepresented as like noble savage, which is frankly insulting. And all of this erases their real struggles that are still going on. You know, they're still trying to get their land back. They're still, their kids are still being taken away. You know, 90% of kids in care in Manitoba are Indigenous, for example. You know, the struggle is there are real struggles still going on. You know, check out my Instagram for a list of Indigenous struggles that are going on around Canada right now. The Wet'suwet'en, the Mi'kmaq, the The Ochre crisis is coming back again. Karnataka, Six Nations, and the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Tiny House Warriors. You know, there are so many struggles again, and that's just Canada. I'm sure there's even more in the US. So, you know, we cannot, like, stealing their culture on top of all the other dreadful stuff that's happened that we've done to them is just adding insult to injury. And finally, Halloween is coming. Please do not dress as a caricature of an Indigenous person. It is just offensive, because what you're doing there is you're wearing an item of clothing that expresses somebody else's identity and their sacred traditions as like a fashion statement or a joke. This is clearly not appropriate. So it doesn't mean that you can't go to your local Indigenous store and buy a nice piece of jewelry or, you know, some other product that they're willing to sell you. It does mean that you can't put the whole outfit on and dress up as them. That's definitely not appropriate. Anyway, so hope you get the idea. You can review this list on my website, inclusivewicca.org. Under articles, there's a section on cultural appropriation. So I will share the link to that in a minute. So having said what is cultural appropriation, I want to talk about what is not cultural appropriation. So if you have been directly taught something by a person from another culture, so for example, yoga or Tai Chi or some other martial art, and that person has authorized you to teach it to other people, then that's not cultural appropriation. So say, for example, I go to my local rabbi and I say, hello, I'd really like to learn about Kabbalah. And the rabbi teaches me Kabbalah, and I get to the point where, you know, I am authorized to pass it on to other people, probably because I'd have to be ordained as a rabbi, so it's somewhat unlikely. But, you know, this is my example. Then I would have the necessary credentials from that tradition to pass that thing on. You know, I'm a Wiccan high priestess. I am authorized to pass on the Wiccan tradition. You know, anybody in my line, anybody who's second degree and above, can pass on the tradition. That the parameters for passing it on are clearly set out, and, you know, are built into the tradition, and other traditions work like that too, right? Right. If, on the other hand, you have been, you know, I go to Tai Chi classes, and the Tai Chi organization that organizes these classes has made it very clear that they only pass on what they were taught by the guy who founded the tradition, who was a Shaolin monk, incidentally. They only pass on what he taught, and they ask their students and their instructors not to pass it on in any other way than the way they were taught and the way that's the consensus of the organization. And, you know, you're not to pass it on to people who, if you're not an instructor, you can't pass it on. And if you are an instructor, you can only pass it on in the way that you've been taught, right? And they keep going back to the centers for more sort of development. So most traditions have an authorized means of transmission. This is completely normal. There is, you know, they don't have a sort of pick and mix approach to these things. Okay, so if you've been passed something in an authorized way by an authorized teacher of the tradition, then it's fine for you to pass it on, as long as you are now an authorized teacher of that tradition. If you are from another culture, like, so I'm from the UK, I live in Canada. So if I go to my local pumpkin patch and, I don't know, hang out with the locals, doing whatever Canadians do in pumpkin patches, then that's not cultural appropriation because I'm participating in the dominant culture. So if I go to an Indigenous powwow and I go to pay my respects at the fire circle, and I am invited by the firekeeper to smudge myself, then that's not cultural appropriation because, you know, he or she or they are teaching me to do the thing correctly. And then now if I then went, right, great, I know how to smudge now, I'm going to take that home and use it in my Wiccan circle, that would be cultural appropriation. See the difference? In the context of the Indigenous practice, where I'm a guest in that space, it would be rude of me not to smudge because that's the protocol in that space. When I come home to my Wiccan circle, if I start smudging in my Wiccan circle, it's definitely cultural appropriation. So it's all about context as well as power differentials and so on. Yeah, so like I said, learning a skill from another culture, like learning a martial art, or I don't know, say somebody wanted to learn Morris dancing, or I don't know, say I wanted to do that German dance where they got the lederhosen and they do sort of thigh slapping or whatever. If I learn that from a German, then that wouldn't be cultural appropriation. Okay, so another key point is that it's not your genetic heritage that entitles you to partake in a practice or take part in a practice. It is the cultural transmission of that practice by people who are authorized to transmit that practice. And it's especially cultural appropriation if the people whose practice it is are oppressed or marginalized. Okay, I now want to turn to talking about Wiccan practice specifically, because a lot of people think that there's tons of cultural appropriation in Wicca. I was having a chat with an Indigenous person on Twitter, and they said that, you know, oh, you pagans are all cultural appropriating all of the time. And I said, actually, most sincere members of the pagan community are really keen to avoid cultural appropriation. And as far as I can tell, I have expunged cultural appropriation from my Wiccan practice. And she said, oh, good, well, great. And then followed me on Twitter because I wasn't cultural appropriating. So anyway, like most of the Wiccans that I know are very keen to avoid cultural appropriation. And people who are part of the wider pagan community tend to be concerned about this issue, right? So, and some people are like, I can't do anything. And I don't think that's, I mean, yeah, like, be extremely cautious about nicking stuff from closed traditions. Obviously, we wouldn't want to do that. But I think it helps to actually clarify what cultural appropriation is. Anyway, so in Wiccan practice, we have a number of things that we do. And so I'm just going to start with the things that we typically do in a ritual and where they came from. Okay, so water and salt. One of the things we do is we consecrate some water and then we consecrate some salt and we mix them together and then we sort of cleanse the circle with them, right? This comes from Western occultism. It's probably from the Key of Solomon originally, fairly widespread practice. Censing the circle with incense. Again, this is a widespread practice in Western occultism and Western spirituality generally. Now, if we use like normal incense, now the thing about when you cleanse somebody with incense in a Wiccan circle, you generally like the one person, I stand still and somebody else waves the incense around at me, right? So whereas with smudging, you do yourself, and I'm not going to demonstrate because I don't want to encourage people to go, oh, that's how you do it anyway, right, because don't do it unless you are invited to do so by an Indigenous firekeeper. So yes, sensing with incense, don't call it smudging, do it the way that it's always been done in Western culture, and it's not cultural appropriation. Okay. Casting a circle, again, this is pretty ancient stuff, comes from the Western occultism, and very clearly known through a number of different cultures. There's a great book by Sarita Deste and David Rankin called Wicca, Magical Beginnings, which goes through in great detail where all this stuff comes from. Calling the quarters. So again, from Western occultism. Now, there is a similar practice in Indigenous spirituality, but the attributions of the quarters are different, and the way in which the quarters are called is different. And I believe they also do stuff in a circle. So the reason there's such a strong similarity between these two things is not because pagans are culturally appropriating Indigenous spirituality. It's because we're both earth-based religions, excuse me, who venerate the earth. And, ancient earth-based spirituality tends to see the world as a series of circles, interlocking circles and cycles, and to honor the sacred directions. If you go to Britain, or indeed anywhere in Europe, probably you can find towns that were laid out by the Romans, and they're laid out with like a street going that way and a street going that way, which are oriented to the four sacred directions. And the whole thing is like a plan of the cosmos. And then, if you go to Royston in Hertfordshire, there's a stone in the middle of Royston, which, the name means kingstone, right? and then under that there's a big cave. So and most you have crosses in the middle of towns that have little steps going up to them, which is like the World Mountain and the World Tree, but Christianized. So the idea of the cosmos being divided into four sacred quarters is very, very ancient and known across many different cultures. And that's where we got it from. We did not steal it from Indigenous Turtle Islanders. Right, raising energy, cone of power is another thing we do, involving dancing, again, very ancient, and mostly appears to come from the folk magic tradition of Britain and Europe, as far as I know. Now, another one that's caused a bit of controversy over recent years is the practice of jumping over a broomstick when you're having a hand fasting. I just had a look at the Wikipedia page on this, and the origins of the practice are not actually clear. It appears to have originated in Wales. It may have originated with the Romani, but from there it spread, or at least the idea of it spread. There are several references to broomstick marriages, which was basically any marriage that took place that wasn't sanctified by the Church of England. Now, whether people actually jumped over a broom or not, we're not sure. But apparently the African-American practice of doing so was popularized by the TV series Roots in the 1970s. So that is a separate they may have got it from the Welsh, I don't know. But that is a separate stream of transmission, if you like, from the pagan practice of doing it. So again, not culturally appropriated. I mean, you might argue that, getting it from the Welsh and possibly the Romany was cultural appropriation. But I think it had already spread into the wider culture sometime in the late 18th, early 19th century. And it was the idea of it was pretty prevalent in the culture generally when modern paganism decided, oh, brooms, we're witches, we use brooms, must be a thing that we did, right? So yeah, not cultural appropriation in my view. Recently there's been a controversy about whether tarot is culturally appropriated from the Romany. Apparently there's a reference to Italians using it for divination about 500 years ago, and it's been in pretty constant use as a divination tool since then. I'm not the kind of person who dismisses claims of things being culturally appropriated out of hand, so I'm kind of sitting on the fence. But I just, tarot is full of Christian imagery. It's clearly a Western occultist thing. I mean, I don't actually do tarot readings myself. I use the runes because I've always felt attached to Anglo-Saxon gods and practices. So that's what I mean about cultural transmission, right? So I'm sitting on the fence on the subject of tarot, but my gut feeling and what I've learned about the topic so far is that if it's been in use for 500 years, trying to claim it's cultural appropriation now is probably bolting the stable door after the horse has bolted, right? Astrology. Don't think that's culturally appropriated. Again, don't actually practice it myself. But it's been widely known across Europe and India since late antiquity, right? So early antiquity, I think, because the Chaldeans started it and then they transmitted it to the Babylonians, and then it's known in India, and it's known has been known in Europe for centuries. And of course, I don't know if I don't think astrologers actually got persecuted, so because it was like posh people's magic, right? So anyway, now we come to aspects of Wiccan practice that are culturally appropriated. I personally would argue that unless you are taught Kabbalah by an actual genuine Jewish Kabbalist, or you are Jewish, or and you've had the Jewish culture transmitted to you, I don't use Kabbalah as part of my Wicca at all. I have read lots of books about it, and it's very interesting, and I find it fascinating. I tend to read books by Jewish Kabbalists, but I think, and again, Kabbalah has been in the cult. Christian Kabbalah was started in the 1600s, but I generally think that trying to shoehorn Kabbalah into Wicca just doesn't fit. Your mileage may vary, but yeah, I mean, if you are Jewish and you've had it transmitted to you through the culture, then fine, but otherwise it probably is. Okay, I already mentioned smudging. Don't call your use of incense smudging. As to whether you can, I mean, it's probably a good idea to not use white sage or Palo Santo, because they are endangered plants now because there's too many people buying them. Lots of other incense is available, and finally I want to talk about chakras. So chakras are from Hinduism. They're also known and practiced differently in Buddhism, and they've been known and used in Western occultism since about probably late 19th century, because the Theosophists came up with a system based on the Hindu system. So with chakras, it very much depends on how you do chakras, in my opinion. So what I did was I went and learnt from a book, actually, rather than from a direct transmission from a practitioner. So and I got the full practice that was as full as I could get. And let me tell you that if you envisage the light just coming in the top of your head and moving down your body, or coming in the bottom and moving up, you're doing it wrong. So, go back to the original source, find out the real Hindu version of the practice, and if you're going to incorporate it into your practice, don't pretend, and I have heard of instances of people doing this, don't pretend that it's always been a Wiccan practice, because it's not. We borrowed it from Hinduism. Now, obviously Hindus aren't particularly marginalized or oppressed these days, but they were historically. Again, this is one of those kind of things of, well, it's clearly from another culture, and does it fit in Wicca? Kind of. There's no massive conflict. But I do know a lot of people who are very uncomfortable with using chakras in Wicca because they do feel it's cultural appropriation. So, obviously don't sell it, don't teach it to other people for money, because that would be cultural appropriation. So yeah, it's down to your individual conscience, I think, on that one. But it probably is cultural appropriation. Okay. So there are plenty of things that you can do that are not cultural appropriation, because you might be thinking, oh dear, that's most of my practice gone out of the window. So the thing to do is learn about folk magic, because that definitely is part of our tradition, and and it's part of our culture, and it's part of our culture that's worth reviving. And also talk to the, if you're in North America, talk to the land spirits where you are and the animal spirits where you are, obviously using your own language, not using indigenous language and symbolism, because if the spirits want to talk to you, they'll talk to you, and it's up to us to make that connection ourselves and not try and nick indigenous spirituality, right? Anyway, I think that's probably obvious. So further resources and things to watch and read, I recommend Laura O'Brien's channel, and I certainly recommend barvas.org. I will now attempt to share the links for you. So here we go. And there we go. Right. So as you can see, I've got a lot of stuff here. I've written a whole bunch of articles about cultural appropriation. As I said, barvas.org that I actually found today, very good. Laura O'Brien, fantastic. And then some good stuff by Crystal Blanton, and also a lot of Indigenous people have written on the topic as well. And I see that I've failed to include Chelsea Vowell on cultural appropriation in this list, so I must add her to it, because she's written some excellent stuff on it as well. Anyway, you can find these links by going to inclusivewicca.org, clicking on articles, and then going to the cultural appropriation link. And I also have a bunch of articles about inclusive Wicca and polarity and anti-racism and resisting fascism and all that good stuff. So check out inclusivewicca.org. And also check out my other videos. I've been doing potted history of witchcraft and potted history of paganism and key ideas in paganism. So lots of stuff there to get your teeth into. And check out my books, Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, and The Night Journey, Witchcraft as Transformation, which you can get from the Doreen Valiente Foundation online shop at shop.doreenvaliente.org. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. Blessed be.